All right, so welcome back to our little virtual classroom here. Today I'm just going to do a quick talk about the circulatory and respiratory systems, just the anatomy and the functions of each. This is a review from the things we went over in class, so I'm going to keep this quick and to the point. Okay. So the circulatory system responsibility is to move blood around your body. Okay. And the reason we need to move blood around our body is to circulate things like nutrients, gases, and hormones. Right? So each of our cells need those things, okay, and they need to get everywhere in our body. The blood is what moves stuff around. Okay. And so the circulatory system really only has two main components. It has the heart and it has the blood vessels. Right? And so the heart is a muscle that can contract, and it pumps the blood through the body. Right? The blood vessels are the tubes that carry the blood. And so they're like hoses. Right? And so you have some big hoses and you have some tiny hoses, right? But they're just hoses. And the blood is never supposed to leave the blood vessels. Right? The blood never gets into your cells. They're always within the hoses. Now, if you get a cut or an injury or something, obviously that's when you start bleeding. These blood vessels get broken, the blood leaks out, right? But that's not the way it's designed. The blood is supposed to stay in this self-contained unit. We have what's called a closed circulatory system, where the blood is always in these tubes, never outside of it. Okay? And so the blood vessels, there are three types. There are the arteries, which are big hoses, and they lead away from the heart. There are veins, which are also big hoses, but they lead towards the heart. And there are capillaries, which are tiny little thin hoses that connect the two. Okay? So you got the arteries leaving the heart, you got the capillaries, and the capillaries lead to the veins, which go back to the heart. Okay? And so the arteries and the veins are quite thick, and nothing can be exchanged between them and the cells. Right? They're just transportation for the blood, moving blood from one place to another. When we actually want to get the stuff out of the blood and into the cells, that's done in the capillaries. Right? So the capillaries are thin enough that stuff can actually cross across them. So like oxygen, for instance, can leave the blood and get into the cell. And then things can leave the cell and get into the blood. So like CO2. So this cell needs more oxygen, it takes it from the blood. This cell wants to get rid of some CO2, it dumps it into the blood. And that happens across the capillaries. So these are very thin, and that exchange can occur. That blood then moves into the veins, and it goes back to the heart. Okay? So pump, 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 transfer, 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 move, move, move. While the blood is traveling from the heart through the artery, that pressure created by the pumping of the heart pushes the blood. Right? So there's no trouble moving the blood when it's in the artery. Easy peasy, just moving because the heart's pumping. Pump, move, pump, move, pump, move. Okay. However, when the blood moves into the capillaries, it is depressurized, right? Because the volume of liquid within the capillaries is now smaller, right? That pressure, when it comes back to the big tube of veins, is lost. So the heart pumping does not push our blood through our veins. The mechanism that is responsible for pushing the blood through the veins is the movement of muscles around those veins. So if you imagine you have an arm, you have an arm, you don't need to imagine it, right? And then in your arm, you have the veins full of blood. Right? Whenever you move this arm, the muscles are going to squish the vein a little bit. When they squish the vein, they push the blood away from it. Inside of the vein, you have little valves that keep the blood from moving backwards against the way that we want it to. And so if we're going up, right, you get the blood right here. Right? You have your muscles contract. Right? And so then, therefore, the blood moves forward. The veins have these valve structures that are shaped like this. Right? And so they let the blood go this way, but then when the pressure's dropped, the blood starts falling back down, but it catches on these valves until muscles here contract and push that blood forward again. And so this is how we get our blood back to our heart. And this is the reason why your legs will fall asleep if you don't move, because nothing's pushing the blood back to the heart. The circulatory system has two main loops. One goes from the heart to pretty much all of the body, right? So whether it be your eyeballs, your toesies, right? This circuit is responsible for those. That's called the somatic circuit. The other circuit goes expressly to the lungs and only the lungs, and that is called the pulmonary circuit. So the arteries that move from the heart to the body carry oxygenated blood, and the veins that move from the body to the heart have low oxygenated blood. Alternatively, on the other side of the storyline, the arteries that move the blood from the heart to the lungs has low O2, and the veins that are bringing that blood back to the heart has high O2. So it goes in this kind of figure eight pattern here. Right? So it flows, the O2 gets used up, goes back to the heart, gets sent to the lungs, comes back to the body. It just goes like this over and over and over again in a big circuit. Yeah, and that's the circulatory system. Boom. So the respiratory system is pretty simple as well. Its job is to exchange gases between the environment around us and our body. Right? So we need to get the oxygen from the air into us, and we need to get the CO2 from our body back into the air. And that's what our respiratory system does. Right? And our human respiratory system is a mammalian respiratory system. And so we breathe, right, using these mechanisms here. We have lungs. The mechanism that's responsible for the actual breathing is caused by this organ called a diaphragm. Right? It's a muscle that sits right about here, and it expands and it contracts. And so when it expands, it opens up our chest cavity, giving more space around our lungs. And so there's less pressure pushing on our lungs. And so air from the atmosphere can go in because there's less pressure pushing it out. Okay? And when the diaphragm shrinks down, our chest cavity shrinks down around our lungs, and it squishes our lungs and it pushes the air back out. Okay, so that's how breathing works. Our lungs themselves are not sucking the air in or pushing the air out. It's the pressure around the lungs created by the chest cavity, depending on whether the diaphragm is expanded or contracted. Okay. So that's how the actual breathing works. This diaphragm right here. And that's why if you get punched in the gut, you can knock the air out of yourself because your diaphragm spasms and it won't contract or expand, so you can't breathe until it resets. Okay. The tube that connects the lungs to the outside world is the trachea. It's connected to our mouth and our nose first, but the trachea is the tube that brings the air down to the lungs. In the lungs, we have these other little tubes, okay? And the first bigger tubes are called bronchi, and then we have the smaller tubes that are called alveoli. And the alveoli is where the actual exchange is occurring of gases. And so the O2 is coming into our blood, and the CO2 is leaving our blood in the alveoli. The alveoli are structured with these folds all over them. They're tiny little folds, lots and lots and lots of them. Right? And inside each of these folds, the capillaries are running. Right? And so this is called a villi, these folds. This is not the only place you see villi. Right? We see villi in our digestive tract as well. But basically, they just increase the surface area so more stuff can go across it. So this is inside the lung. I have a bunch of oxygen. Okay. This is our blood. It has a bunch of CO2. Okay. And so the oxygen here will cross the villi into the blood and get taken back to the heart. Right. And the CO2 will leave the blood and then get breathed out when we exhale. And that's it. That's how the respiratory system works. Those are all the parts. And so the connection between the two is this here, right? the exchange of these gases in the blood. And so this lets us get rid of CO2 from all over our body, no matter where it was, because the circulatory system goes everywhere. Right? And then the lungs get it back out to the atmosphere. Right? And then the oxygen comes in from the environment, goes into our blood, goes all over our body, right? Because there's a connection between the two systems. And yeah, that's it. That's the two of them. Hopefully that was nice and short and clear. Cool. Have yourselves an awesome day. Bye.